There we go. Okay, well, welcome everybody to a short history of the left, a series of teach-ins hosted by the West Coast Platypus affiliated society chapters, which are located in Corvallis, Oregon, the Bay Area, Santa Cruz, and Los Angeles. All right, I'm just going to keep admitting people. If I stop my script, it's because I'm admitting. Okay, the Platypus Affiliated Society, if you don't know, is a campus-based group. It was established in Chicago in 2006. Wait a sec, there we go. I think I've got everybody. In Chicago in 2006. Wait a sec. I'm gonna just stop for just 1 second. Why can't I admit everybody? There we go. Admit. Okay. All right. Maybe I could make Audrey a co-host, and then Audrey could. I'll do that.
Yeah, that's fine.
And I'll get you to ring people in there. All right. Make a host. I'll be okay. I'll handle it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. The Platypus Affiliated Society is a campus-based group. It was established in Chicago in 2006. I know I was there. It organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from, we're going to be using these terms tonight, the old, which means the 1920s to 30s, the new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left. And we do this for the possibility of, originally the way we envisioned it is for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. That history is really important to being able to open the space for something new to either occur or to be recognized. Now, we do this through a series of activities, the public fora and teach-ins that, like this one we're doing tonight. We have an open submission journal, the Platypus Review, which is free, and past issues are typically available at several locations on the campuses that we're at, but they're accessible online. And I'm really glad for the people from Oregon today. It features a panel, which our teach-in presenter was actually a panelist on, that was an Oregon-based panel. So check it out. And we are always looking for contributions. So if you hear something tonight and you really have a thought wave, we would encourage you to contact the editor and write a response. We also have a weekly reading group. It's a semester-long series on revolutionary Marxists. It is truly Marxism. It's truly remarkable. You won't really run into anything like this, and it's going to touch on some of the themes might kind of echo here, but especially with the Frankfurt School, which we'll be dealing with a little bit later. It's on Saturdays, and one of the I think we have Matt, who organizes the reading group. He will put the information in the chat so that if you're interested in joining us, we welcome it. And this week, I believe, Matt, we are doing
Rosa Luxemburg on the mastering.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, and I also want to just also point out that tomorrow we have a weekly film viewing party, and we're going to be doing Warren Beatty's Reds. And so it's on a Friday night, open beverage, and every time you see Emma Goldberg, you can take a shot of vodka or something. Okay, April 1st to 4th is our virtual conference. It's a really great opportunity. It's typically held in Chicago. It involves people from right across the world. I think we have Nick from Australia here today, but we have a lot of people who are working on Platypus in Germany, in the UK, in Greece. And so it's a great opportunity to meet up. So April 1st to 4th, and there's going to be some themes. And Danny Jacobs, one of our members in Philadelphia, pointed out the themes echo a theme that we took up 10 years ago that has taken on new relevance. Namely, the legacy of Trotskyism seems to have come back in a way, and the politics of critical theory. There's sort of a renewed interest in critical theory in the Frankfurt School. So don't miss it. We will, if you're interested in any of these things, just message me privately, and I will connect you to our lists. Okay. Tonight, we're going to the second in our series of teach-ins titled The Short History of the Left, which is also the title of one of the founding documents of our organization. And I'll post that document in the chat. And the first paragraph of that document states, Marx was not an author, but the brilliant critical participant of the left in the 19th century. Socialism and communism were not invented by Marx, Engels, and their collaborators and opponents on the left, but issued from the contradiction of modern society itself, as expressed in the French Revolution of 1789 and in the modern labor movement that emerged with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Marx's great insight was to regard the left itself as symptomatic of capitalism that doesn't oppose it from without, but from within, imminently. Nevertheless, Marx endorsed the left, the modern socialist worker movement, and sought to push it further and provoke recognition of how it pointed beyond itself. Our goal in this series of teach-ins that involves either younger members or close contacts of Platypus is to get their thoughts on tracing the project of the left over the 20th century into the present. And we're going to be taking up this week, Conrad Cartwell is going to be talking about the 1960s New Left, but next, in 2 weeks, we're going to be taking up the 1980s post-political left with Carson Wright from Corvallis. Okay, I'm going to hand things over to Conrad. Stop this thing and take it away, Conrad. I'm going to...
Hey guys. So unlike a lot of Platypus members, I don't have really any experience teaching people things, at least not in a good way. So I am just going to read an essay that I wrote, and I hope you guys will forgive me. All right, this is the New Left. In 1969, Carl Oglesby, who had from 1965 to 1966 been the president of Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, asked the question, why not simply the current left? What did the new left seek to counter-identify itself with, and why did it feel the need to openly proclaim this? The answer to this question of why the new left lies in the failure of what looked by the 1950s to be a very old left indeed, where once the USSR and the Communist International had stood strong, at least in words, if not deeds, for the world revolution, now that same demand had disappeared from the face of the earth, liquidating itself first in the doctrine of socialism in one country, then in its formal dissolution in the Second World War, and finally, in the eyes of the New Left, in Khrushchev's secret speech and the adoption of a policy of peaceful coexistence. Perhaps more jarring to the leftists of the day than the apparent capitulation of the Soviet Union was the fact that the predictions of previous lefts up until that point seemed to have all been disproven by the run of history. For too long, the new leftists thought the old left had been content to make dire conjectures or predictions or prophecies without much examination of whether or not these prophecies were actually realistic. When it turned out that the Bolshevik Revolution was not the toxin of the World Revolution, when the Great Depression didn't lead to a revolutionary upsurge, when World War II didn't kick off a period of political disintegration in the Allied countries, all that was left was to point at the post-war prosperity and proclaim that the newfound stability and relative opulence of the working class was but an illusion. Unsurprisingly, this kind of exhortation didn't just fail to convince the masses, it also failed to keep the extant left afloat. By the late 50s, many former socialists and communists had cast off their former radical opinions and affiliations and had settled into the stability of post-war America. These people had lived through the 1930s, and they knew how relatively bad things could get. If capitalism could deliver the goods, what sense was there in asking for more? But perhaps most of all, the failure of the old left was the apparent failure of the working class in the advanced countries. No matter how much socialists of the era may have howled about repression at the hands of the House Un-American Activities Committee and the rise of fascism, the questions remained. Why did the workers permit the purge? Why did they support fascism instead of making the revolution? Who were the workers anyway? Were the white-collar professions part of the working class? They may have held good jobs, but they didn't seem to want to engage in radical politics. What about the blue-collar workers? They held jobs too, sometimes good, sometimes not so much, but they didn't embrace the left either. Were there any working-class people in America at all, or had they been displaced overseas into the periphery? The new left was the product of exasperation with all of these failures, but it was also the product of more novel forms of discontent in post-war society. Chief amongst these was the, quote, difficult to grasp quality of their lives, the intensity with which they felt the subtle existential oppression imposed by modern America, with its anonymous cities, bowling alleys, and shopping centers. There was the impression that society was at risk of ceasing to be formed by the conscious will of man, as it had in the past, but that, quote, history may now be made by default. Society in the USA and the Soviet Union had given rise to a new convergent character type, the cheerful robot, the technological idiot, the crackpot realist, intelligent and obsessed with detail, but ultimately uninterested in asking big questions or confronting the insanity and inhumanity of the world around them. What the New Left wanted most of all was authenticity, and they weren't just going to find it through counterculture, they were going to find it through politics. They rejected the creature comforts of suburban life and lusted to go south and get their hands and their heads, their lives, into the dangerous, the moral, and therefore the authentic. They demanded that ideas and activity be coupled in a psychologically satisfying way, to think ideas and follow through on them no matter the danger. This desire for authenticity and the sense that their own lives weren't so, fed into a distinctive pattern of the New Left of looking beyond the movement itself to locate seemingly more authentic forces elsewhere, usually so identified because of a larger degree of perceived suffering under contemporary society. The birth of the New Left in the late 1950s was forerun by two separate phenomena, the peace movement and the Beat Generation. The world of the 1950s was overshadowed by the constant threat of nuclear catastrophe, and, unlike today, people were actually acutely aware of this. The peace movement was the inheritor of a religious politics of earlier American history. Many of its leaders and members were Quakers, etc., and its political style tended to reflect this, with a strong emphasis on bearing witness to injustice and civil disobedience. The Radical Pacifists also developed other qualities that prefigured what the New Left would be about, like direct action, over-the-top rhetoric, and participatory democracy. It should be said that the focus here on tactics and style may sell the pacifists short. Some of them, like Bayard Rustin and A.J. Muste, managed to foment a massive crisis in the electoral coalition of the Democratic Party that completely changed the field of US politics. If the New Left inherited its political techniques from the pacifists, it may have inherited its style from the Beats, exemplified by literary figures like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who also reveled in the absurdity and meaninglessness of modern life. What the Beats didn't do was grant this absurdity a political character. In fact, they often explicitly rejected doing so. While the Beat Generation may have thought nothing was political, the New Left thought that essentially everything was. Their emphasis on moral witness and new ways of living meant that everyday actions that most people would have skipped over without a second thought were imbued with social and political meaning. One of the reasons that this was possible was that a unifying attitude to the New Left was something that they called anti-authoritarianism. It may strike one as odd to turn in this moment to Marxist critical theorist Theodor Adorno, who is traditionally associated with an earlier era of left history and famously called the police on student radicals occupying one of his lectures. However, towards the end of his life, he provided some of the most incisive criticism of the emerging anti-authoritarian New Left. The New Left of the 60s may have been comprised of students, but that didn't mean that it was composed of intellectuals. In SDS, there was a thin layer of intellectual cadre in the organization, but the massification of American higher education meant that most of the members of the organization were the quote-unquote shock troops, relatively ignorant and generally younger members. The two groups hated each other, but both were prone to wild swings in political opinion based on the last essay that they had read. Students around the world, including in Frankfurt, were carrying out their program with a campaign of building occupations and lecture interruptions, mouthing slogans like, quote, "The professors are the servants of the state," "There is no time for sober reflection," and "Whoever occupies himself with theory without acting practically is a traitor to socialism." Adorno observed that such rejection of the authoritarian tendency to reflect on conditions combined with their omnidirectional rebellion affirmed that the student movement on the whole was symptomatic of a particular tendency that was, as Adorno observed, regressive, fascist in potential, and authoritarian in its attitude. Adorno was, of course, also opposed to authoritarianism, but in a different way. Through his research earlier in the 20th century on the authoritarian personality, he came to understand that the authoritarian character structure that confronted people in the post-war period was not simply to be found in the Nuremberg rallies, the parades of the Soviet Union, but also in popular front mobilization in the West and anti-colonial nationalist movements in the Third World. This was because, for Adorno, the authoritarian personality and its dual expressions in authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism were not personal failings, but rather an emergent phenomena of the structure of society itself, of capitalism's contradiction expressing both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary potential. What the situation demanded was a critical assessment of this reality and the conscious effort to move through and beyond it, not a one-sided rejection of authority. Adorno observed that those who protest most vehemently are similar to authoritarian personalities in their aversion to introspection, and would thus be blocked from actually making progress towards the transformation of society by their actions. And although the students claimed to be against authoritarian principles in the abstract, indeed they ended up glorifying fairly nightmarish things. In their correspondence, Adorno's friend and colleague, Herbert Marcuse, defended the young students against the charge of reaction, writing that the situation in the world was, quote, so terrible, so suffocating, so demeaning, that rebellion against it forces a biological, physiological reaction. One can bear it no longer. One has to let some air in. To this, Adorno replied that if the only defense for the students or any action was the rottenness of the situation, that one should not protest against the horror of napalm bombs, but also against the unspeakable Chinese-style tortures, very nice turn of phrase there, that the Viet Cong carry out permanently. If you do not take that on board too, then the protest against the Americans takes on an ideological character. From SDS's subsequent history, it can only be said that Adorno was right. What the students were looking for in terms of action, they located in Third World revolutionaries like Castro, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, and Jomo Kenyatta. What they were looking for in terms of authenticity, they found in Black radicals in the States and the writings of Frantz Fanon, who, in his encouragement to the colonized people of the world to rebel, called violence a, quote, cleansing force. Pulled in multiple contradictory ideological directions at once, the students in the late 60s were radicalizing quickly, moving sharply in a pro-Third World, anti-American, and sometimes plainly anti-social direction. Emblematic examples include Noam Chomsky and Susan Sontag, who famously remarked that, quote, the white race was the cancer of human history. As they radicalized further, SDS dramatically cracked under its own weight. At their 1969 convention, a major argument broke out between two opposed factions. One, Progressive Labor, following a Maoist line, insisted that the SDS needed to work to build a worker-student alliance. This was because, although SDS had been foiled in all previous attempts to organize working people, of which there were a few, they stuck by their reading of Marx and insisted that the working class was the only possible revolutionary agent in capitalist society. This meant that they were cooler towards the rising Black Power movement than the rest of SDS, a stance that would later get them in trouble. They were also seen to be soft on the question of the Vietnam War, being insufficiently supportive of the PAVN, who they accused of selling out the revolution in their negotiations with the Americans. Opposed to Progressive Labor was the Revolutionary Youth Movement, which broke from them based on its assessment of the revolutionary agent. RYM, as its name would suggest, considered the, quote, youth not to be a distinct class in society, but did think that they had an important radicalizing role to play. Where RIM stood apart from PL most decisively, however, was on the question of American Black people's place in the revolution. Where PL largely regarded Blacks as a section of the working class, RYM thought that Blacks generally, and the Black Panthers specifically, who they had developed close ties to, were the vanguard of the American Revolution, constituted an internal colony, and above all else, required self-determination. As the convention progressed, delegates from the Black Panthers made some remarks to the assembly that could possibly be construed as being sexist, and the Progressive Labor were denounced as having deviated from the correct Marxist-Leninist line on the national right to self-determination. They were then denounced as racist, and the RIM people walked out of the convention, effectively marking the end of the organization. The RIM group subsequently split further into the Weather Underground, who famously thought that the most opportune strategy for the revolution and the present moment was street scuffles with the police combined with bombing campaigns, and RIM 2, who thought that a slower party building strategy was in order. Today, you can still find progressive labor members around doing entry work in unions. Some of them have been on Platypus panels. You can also find RIM 2 members in influential places. One of them, Bob Avakian, is the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party USA, an organization whose members and affiliates Platypus is also hosted. As for the Weather Underground, after carrying out a chain of attacks, including bombing casts of the famous statue The Thinker due to its reflection and supposed celebration of Enlightenment values, and a bombing of a number of government buildings, probably their most spectacular achievement was destroying a house in Greenwich Village they were living in, killing 3 of their members, and no one else. Most weathermen got off after the organization disintegrated with light sentences due to the fact that the FBI had gone to massively illegal lengths to track them all down. After all of this, what did the New Left achieve? In the end, perhaps their greatest legacy is to be found in certain modern universities and departments therein, a sort of a permanent haven for the counterculture, a radicalizing influence where young people can go learn about the histories and stories of the oppressed, alternative ways of living, and talk about how to bring about change. But this wasn't all. They also ended up providing ideological cover for the coming neoliberal wave in world politics. Where the old administration of capitalism had been stifling with its company and union men and its picket fences, the new world that was being born in the 1970s and 1980s would be much freer, with a multiplicity of new subcultures and cultural products to choose from, modified sexual relations, more flexible career paths, and a reconfiguration of the welfare state. Perhaps it wasn't the future that the New Left wanted, but it was the future that they asked for. Perhaps the most emblematic and yet tragic story of the period is that of David Gilbert. Born into a middle-class Jewish family in a Boston suburb, David joined CORE in his teens, and while studying at Columbia, helped found the school's SDS chapter. He went on to join the Weather Underground, but unlike other members, he refused to emerge from the underground in the 1970s and kept up the life with his partner, Kathy Bowden. In 1981, they were involved in an armed robbery of a Brinks truck with members of the Black Liberation Army that ended up resulting in the death of 1 Brinks worker and 2 police officers. Both him and Kathy were sent to prison, while their young son was sent to live with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. David's wife, Kathy, became a law professor after leaving prison, but David remains dutifully stuck in the past, writing about imperialism and whiteness from his jail cell until this day. He'll be eligible for parole in 2056. Perhaps most interesting is the career trajectory of his child. Raised by Ayers and Dorn, after a stint of working for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, has gone on to have a successful legal career, and in 2019 became the district attorney of San Francisco, a position that was previously held by Kamala Harris. And I think that, that sort of wraps up with a nice bow the ultimate trajectory of the New Left. Extremely radical, sometimes dangerously so, and sort of ending in these seemingly the same place as everyone else anyway. And that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Conrad. And we've got a good amount of time, and there's, you hit your clap emoticons, or maybe Conrad made you angry and you can use the tear emoticon. It's this is a great opportunity for discussion, and I just want to encourage people who may be new to this material not to be. I think what Conrad laid out was very thick and contextual, and maybe hard for you need to process it. But if you have any basic questions, those are great. But also, other broader questions or comments are great. So just to put that out there, I might just if there's a couple of really penetrating questions, I might just open it up and ask if there's any kind of basicer questions. But let's anybody like to kick off the discussion?
Did you say there was a tie-in with Marcuse and like Angela Davis somewhere in there, or maybe I misheard? Oh, you might be muted.
I didn't mention it during the course of the essay, but Angela Davis did study under Adorno in Frankfurt and famously kind of left to go study under Marcuse in California. You know, I'm not sure how much of that was in the background of the letters that I quoted in the essay, but it's certainly sort of an interesting episode.
Ryan, our member from Australia, has a really great question. And Ryan, maybe just explain what the Grundrisse is and lay your question out a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that, Conrad. That was really good. I was just wondering, I know that particularly Martin Niklaus, the Maoist, sort of was very influenced and sort of promulgated the return to Marx through the rediscovery of the Grundrisse. But I'm not sure how much that influenced like American left in general. Was there a similarly a big return to Marx found through the Grundrisse or through other texts?
And maybe there looks like there's some newer people on here. Explain what the Grundrisse is.
So the Grundrisse, I understand, is like a collection of notes Marx wrote, like drafts for the book which became Capital. In some sense, it was like an early version of Capital that never became published and involved like an extension of the thing he wrote about the critique of political economy that sort of was only one chapter. So it was an unfinished Marx work that I think was never published, but then was discovered in Moscow in like 1950 or something. Like the Stalinists had got it out from Germany, and then it was sort of only translated into French in the 60s largely by Niklaus, and then I think in English in the early 70s. So it was like a new piece of Marx that emerged in this era and represented somehow like a point to return to Marx or find a new orthodox Marxism.
That's great, Ryan. Thank you so much. All right, Conrad.
Yeah, so I mean, given my research, I would say the answer to this question is a bit contradictory. Certainly there were a lot of people around the New Left who, had all these problems with what they saw as Marxist orthodoxy of the past. And people were extremely excited about, the concepts like alienation and estrangement that they were discovering in different writings like the Grundrisse and the 1844 manuscripts. However, and this is something that I unfortunately wasn't able to get into in the presentation because just because of a lack of time to prepare, basically. But I think despite all of the kind of Marxist-Leninist, Maoist trappings of the New Left, it's actually fairly difficult to assess the connection of the New Left to Marxism qua Marxism, partially because they never really form a socialist party or reform the socialist party, as one might put it, but also because of the broadly kind of anti-intellectual character of large sections of the movement and the kind of rapid away from socialism trajectory of a lot of its figures directly after kind of the end of the early 70s. Like you look down a list of old Weather Underground people and they're like all liberal law professors, basically. It's the connection to Marx or the connection to socialism often seems pretty tenuous.
Thanks, Conrad. Tom, you have a question as well, and I think it builds well from Conrad's last comments.
Oh, sure. Thank you. sort of like one of Platypus's sort of like founding slogans is that the left is dead, long live the left. And so the assumption is that in the current time and ever since Platypus was founded, the left is actually dead and needed to be reconstituted. I'm wondering whether you think that the left was dead during the heyday of the new left, and whether you regard the new left as a living left, that whose demise or retreat was some kind of regression for the left.
I mean, I don't want to get too stuck on like trying to locate the exact point at which the left died, because I think that would be pretty hard to pin down. But I would say, just my broad estimation would be that the new left was essentially a step backwards. Really, that they were pretty good, I would say, about identifying problems with the old left, kind of as they inherited them. But it seems to me like they generally came to pretty outlandish conclusions about what the solutions to those problems might be, and just in general kind of went about attempting to answer them in the wrong way. So yeah, maybe not already dead, but sort of in the process of dying.
Tom, maybe you want to keep going with this. The one thought I had was the thread that you raised was the peace movement, and you situated it with people who came from the old left. So Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and A.J. Muste. And, they in some ways had different political ambitions than the new left, and, found themselves on the other side, opposed by, many of these people around the Vietnam War. And I wondered how you thought about the older generation and the newer generation. The other thing that comes to my mind, I remember one of the films that we sometimes watch in Platypus is Arguing the World, where Irving Howe, and somebody could help me, was like, it was like one of the new left figures. He was trying to sort of like transmit some of the problems of the past, at least through his own standpoint. And it really didn't, maybe Angela Davis would be another example of a new leftist who's coming up against the old, the Frankfurt School. Why do you
it's Tom Hayden.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I wondered about how you thought about that generation of the 50s who still remembered the old left and encountered these this other generation. It almost felt like in the presentation is like they were responsible because they were the peace movement, and the personal, political, it sort of all came along. I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about that transition, the best that you can. I know it's.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, and perhaps Audrey could actually jump in here because I know she was giving me a lot of reading advice on the subject. But I don't want to give the impression that this is just like people who were in the peace movement's fault for the new left. That is just like a one-to-one correspondence. It goes from this to this. There was stuff floating around in the left atmosphere that you could say sort of pointed to the new left, I guess. But I think most new leftists would have far more consciously conceptualized what they were doing as a rebellion against kind of the perceived lack of radicalism of this previous generation. People like Rustin, who basically pursue integrationist and union politics after the civil rights movement, or people like Adorno, who sit around going like, maybe the thing that we need to do right now is sit down and have a hard think about things.
Maybe here's a better way of putting it. Like we also together read Murray Bookchin's critique of the old left, which, you know, in some ways seemed to have some content to it. Like his critique seemed to sort of point to some deficiencies. And do you think it was do you think that previous generation, in some ways it comes across maybe as a liability that, you know, that they, you know, someone like Bookchin is very kind of like strident that there's nothing to learn from Marxism. That's why we have to resurrect anarchism. Or were they just an unutilized resource? Or I'm just kind of I'm digging myself in a hole. But I like Tom's question. It's like, you know, it was the New Left just like already kind of like doomed to failure? What was the opportunity of the New Left? Because I think you've painted a very good picture of how the New Left failed in its aspirations, but the question of like, what was its opportunity, and was it an opportunity? I think that's what Tom was getting at, is like, was there something there?
Yeah, I mean, was there something there? I mean, there's always sort of something there, especially when something might be existential angst at the you know, misery of everyday life in America. And I think that, you know, like you know, you look back on lefts at the past and they all responded to real problems, right? And generally real problems that were changing from one era to another that require some level of, you know, learning from the past. But not just an outright rejection of it. You could say that like the old left's thinking had become an obstacle to its success, given, you know, the aforementioned kind of failed prophecies, and that, you know, maybe the thinking of a new revolutionary movement would have to be updated to deal with, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union into kind of conservatizing politics internationally, and the collapse of the workers' movement more generally. But that doesn't mean that you would just kind of throw out the lessons of the past, a la Bookchin, and, you know, just adopt something completely new. It would be more a question of, I don't know, why the past worked out the way that it did, and how that serves to explain the discontents that we have now.
That slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left," that was an attempt to get ahead of the curve in terms of the millennial left, meaning it wouldn't have made sense regarding the new left because there had not yet been a repetition that fell below its kind of ancestor, right? Like, you know, in other words, the only kind of failure up until then was the old left, right? Or actually prior to that, really like Lenin, and then the old left being actually after that generation.
Yeah.
And so what stands out and why that slogan has a purchase is that the new left repeats and updates problems of the old left. And so then the millennials were repeating that yet again. And so that's where that slogan comes from. Otherwise, it's not just like, I don't think it would have made sense, actually. And not only that, there were plenty of objects of criticism in the new left that the millennials didn't have, like the Soviet Union, for example, which is a component part. I wanted to raise a question, though, because you mentioned Oglesby, right, in your first sentence of your presentation. And you mentioned the theory question as well. You brought up Adorno and I guess the recalcitrance towards theory. So Oglesby has a way of defending the new left's suspicion of theory. He says it's wrong, but he does say that there is something to it, and it has to do with the new left's relation to the old left. So I was wondering what you thought about that. Meaning he's saying they kind of associate theory. It's not really with thinking, but they associate it, right? Yeah, I see you shaking your head with something.
Yeah, sorry, I'm leafing through my my copy of the essay. Yeah, I mean, they associate theory with And I mean, this is kind of where the anti-authoritarianism part of this equation comes in too, right?
Right.
This association of theory with, kind of old guys leading old left political parties, thinking a lot and handing down ultimately sort of incorrect verdicts on the movement's direction from above, right?
Right.
I mean,
They
that's-
associate it with
That's
like,
totally fair.
right. Yeah.
So wait, what's the question?
Well, I was wondering what you thought about it. You just said it's totally fair, but I didn't think you would just agree with Oglesby. I mean, you could say it's more prickly than that, than to just like, Oglesby is actually like defending them and saying, look, their anti-theoretical stance was a necessary stance they had to take.
Yeah, well, I mean, saying something's, wait, am I getting echo? No. Saying something's fair, like, that was a problem, or that did turn out to be a problem in the old left, doesn't necessarily mean that theory is a problem to court, right? The kind of failure of the old left to develop the type of productive relationship between thinking about stuff and doing stuff that ultimately led to their complete failure. The observation of that is a good one. And, the rejection of it by kind of young, impressionable people is understandable. Although perhaps not productive in the final analysis. I do think, though, that there is something to defend against the new left's, and I guess this is what I'm trying to get at. There is something to defend in the new left's desire to counter-identify itself with the old left. There is something to acknowledging the defeats of the past, even if you don't really wrestle with and come to terms with those defeats yourself. I think. I have no idea though.
Anyway, I'm going to just flag that for a little bit later, but I know there's a number of people who wanted to respond. Let's get Daniel Rudin and then Audrey. And then if somebody on this call is really new to this and has even a basic question, that's very welcome. But let's start with Daniel Rudin.
Yeah, thanks, Andoni. You might have already answered the question, Conrad, but I was just wondering, this kind of Tom brought up is the new left dead in the water, and you mentioned the Beats and the 50s, but I was thinking of Daniel Bell, who he actually talks about the intelligentsia is traumatized in the 40s through the experience, specifically, I guess, of the Second World War, and this leads it into this kind of cultural turn. But there's a step in the 50s where this sort of existentialism is has the run of the court, and that, I guess, is what really infects the and motivates the cultural turn in the subsequent decade in the 60s. Anyway, so I guess there's something interesting there to Bell's theory that he doesn't really extensively treat, but would you agree? Is there some sort of trauma or block that the new left inherits, sort of in the womb, as it were?
Well, I should say I don't know anything about Daniel Bell, but I think if the new left inherits a trauma, it only, like, I don't know what that trauma could be beyond, like I said, just the failure of the old left. And, World War I, also World War II, fascism, etc. I mean, I think you could possibly say that the new left doesn't inherit the trauma, that it's really kind of that older generation of people that, that traumatic effect is a kind of an influence on, and that the new left really just inherits post-war opulence. But I'm not sure. What do you think?
I guess I'm just recalling now. So alienation, I guess if you say the left is not really taking up that kind of Marxian alienation, but this sort of more existentialist alienation, it's sort of very non-Marxist and very much connected to the 50s and existentialism. So I would generally agree with you that they haven't inherited the historical experience of the old left, in part because it's been destroyed. And I don't want to take up more time, but I guess that was the bridge for, there's sort of preparatory work that's being done by the intelligentsia that they do inherit and maybe mistake for Marx in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about existentialism is interesting. I have never read Jean-Paul Sartre, but I have read Simone de Beauvoir, and I remember very distinctly being struck by the fact that in the Ethics of Ambiguity, like her, she's sort of like a soft supporter of communism, but her big problem with like the party and the image of the wandering communist revolutionary is that they're all way too serious. And if they just took things a little bit more lightly, perhaps they'd be living their lives as much more authentic people instead of, kind of sacrificing themselves to a higher duty. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but it's just something that sort of tickled my memory just now.
Conrad, Audrey has a question, and then we had someone who's a little bit newer who had some questions about books. But let's start with Audrey. Audrey, why don't you set your question up so that everybody can hear it?
Yeah, I mean, now that I hear Daniel, I mean, it's sort of tied into his question. I guess I'm just trying to kind of bring this back to politics, and which kind of ties into Tom Cannell's question, I guess, ultimately, like, what do we mean by the left, right? And all of that centers on this issue of the revolutionary subject for, historical transformation of society. And I guess, new left really does refer, or neo-Marxism or new left really does, the newness of it is this idea that there's a new subject. And what Unger and other people have called, sorry, there's some background noise on my end, have called like the new working class theory, the idea that students, it's not so much that they replaced the workers, as much as there's this idea that, higher education has become proletarianized, and now universities are sort of the new factories for a post-industrial labor force. It's sort of tied to the view that the historical function of the industrial proletariat was not a socialist revolution, but just industrialization, which helps to maybe flesh out this kind of prejudice that the workers are maybe very socially conservative. And it like ties into Daniel Rudin's question, which is that this idea of existential angst as opposed to the Marxian conception of alienation. And I think that that's still with us today, this confusion. So I guess the idea is like that critique was like kind of assumed to be this negative stance towards society, this kind of like teenage angst towards your parents and consumerism, versus like Marxian critique, which understood the historical role of the industrial proletariat, not in their views towards like racism or homosexuality or gender or something, but that they were, because they were integrated into society, that is what allowed for this sort of like subject-object tension to rise to the level of politics. And I don't know, maybe you could say more about just this search for a new revolutionary subject and ultimately how that tied into their political strategy or lack thereof in terms of socialist revolution.
Okay, there's a lot there. I mean, as far as the connection between the search for a revolutionary subject and their political strategy, I think if you're at the place where you're trying to figure out, like where it's not immediately obvious who the kind of revolutionary people in society are, you're in big trouble when it comes to formulating a program for immediate action for a socialist revolution, right? And certainly, you know, the kind of remarkable thing about what the New Left does is they spend all this time searching for these people. Like early in the 60s, it's like, you know, we're going to go to the South and like, you know, engage in the civil rights movement and try to change society that way. Then they do the Economic Research Action Project, and it's like we're going to go try to mobilize poor white people in northern cities. And then, you know, they go through the entire new working class thing. You know, maybe it's students. Black Panthers show up. Oh wait, shit, we forgot. You know, it's back to the early 60s, except they're more radical and Marxist-Leninist this time. It's going to be black people, and suddenly the internal colony thesis is back. And finally, you know, there are people who shake out talking about how like women and gay people are going to be, you know, the like classes that make the revolution. It all, like in retrospect, it has kind of a ridiculous air to it because just none of it works. But I think, you know, just demonstrates the extent that for the New Left and its thinking, the cart kind of comes before the horse in terms of developing revolutionary politics.
I would push back on that though. I mean, I think it's all kind of smoothed over from to our vantage point, this idea that like, you know, they were searching for, you know, people who are going to transform society, which I think is unfair. You know, because I mean, transform society, I mean, in that sense, they did succeed.
Yeah, I mean,
because what is
they
transformation of
transformed
society? Well, transformation into more capitalism, into neoliberalism, which is the legacy of the New Left, neoliberalism. And Nixon, Vietnamization, ending the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
I mean, the legacy of the New Left is Nixon and then neoliberalism. So they did succeed in that sense. But I mean, Unger says the decade was a period when virtually, the 60s was a period when virtually every group that felt itself despised or victimized by the power of others developed a defiant response. And he says that near the end of the book, right? Which is when it's that. But earlier, right? Early in the 60s, there was like a real earnest attempt to kind of reapproach this question of the revolutionary subject for socialism.
Yeah,
in the crisis of the New Deal coalition.
I like the way that you're posing it, Audrey, because it is in some sense the way you started is why didn't it coalesce into politics? Like why do these kind of like discontents end up becoming a cultural turn or becoming the personal everything? I like, you know, what Conrad said, that everything became political, and then there's a way in which perhaps these discontents had the capacity to, you know, lead somewhere, and they did lead to transformation, but not in a kind of conscious political way, and certainly not in the direction of socialism or something.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like now we, you know, the legacy of the New Left is just like the search for the new oppressed subject or subjects, but that wasn't really the case for Mills in his letter to the New Left, or, you know, in the New Left Review in London, or, you know, for Harrington and Shachtman and Rustin, the realignment strategy. Like that wasn't the case for those people. So you know, it's like maybe there was a shift. There was something that happened.
It does make me think. I remember Huang and I we had a contact in Corvallis, somebody who's in their 20s in the DSA, and he said, you know, the problem was the New Left. He said, we have to go back to the 30s. We need the working class. I can't get a job. I don't know why, all these cultural politics. And there was a kind of way in which the New Left, whatever the New Left went through was like not very, didn't seem that important. And I did wonder, when I heard it, I was like, huh, that's funny. And we've had this on other Platypus panels where we've had people say, oh yeah, the New Left, it was a big liability. It was, we should have just skipped over it or something.
The millennials have a ambivalent relationship, or they did at least, towards the New Left, meaning at times they were really trying to recreate aspects of the New Left. Like, there's like a fetish for the Black Panthers and different Black power turns. And then there will be, the problem is that everything was cultural. So they kind of then have this one-sided critique. Because even something like the personal is political, which today just sounds like just pure neoliberalism, right? It's like the Pepsi commercial is how Catherine Liu put it to me on a panel like 4 years ago, almost to this date, is that the personal was political could have been a very critical dialectical statement in the 60s, because it was a way of saying, look, the domestic house life is part of a sort of political compromise of labor with the state after World War II. That it kind of assumes into existence, it presupposes one wage earner and therefore one spouse that would be taking care of domestic life in a certain way, right? So that would have been the way in which the personal is political and could have had a really critical character. Whereas today, now we have like the worst aspect of it, which is really the latter part. And I think this is what Audrey was getting at by bringing up Mill's early letter versus the latter part of the New Left, which of course these things all get amalgamated into one history, right? Like there's no difference between 1969 and 1959. Where personal is political today now means it's like an excuse to not even do anything political, because the idea is that you're political in your opinion or in what you eat or whatever, choose whatever personal behavior in that sense. And so that part is dropped out. And I feel like, when the millennials respond to the New Left, as Andoni was just mentioning, they respond to like the worst aspects, but they kind of take them on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel's raising his hand.
So, wait, before that, Dee asked a question, and Audrey, Dee, you can unmute it and ask your question if you'd like, but also Audrey provided some responses. But you've done a lot of preparation for this teach-in, and I think Dee was wondering what were some of the most interesting books that you encountered. Go ahead, Dee. Why don't you set it up? That's awesome.
Oh no, I mean, I think that was it really. Thanks for the suggestions, Audrey. Yeah, I guess I was just interested in either like primary or secondary texts that sort of, that you've encountered or that, you would recommend.
Yeah, so basically two of these texts are sort of standards of Platypus pedagogical history, I guess, on their reading groups on the New Left. One is The Movement by Erwin Unger. The other is The New Left Reader, which is edited by Carl Oglesby, who I quoted at the beginning of that teach-in. A fair amount of the background for the Adorno stuff comes from this collection, Critical Models, which contains an essay called Resignation and another one called Marginalia on Theory and Praxis, which also I think are important for Platypus, but I've enjoyed in the past as well. And then the other thing kind of in the background of that essay or talk or whatever the hell that was, is a correspondence between Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse that was from 1969, like right before Adorno dies, that was published in the New Left Review pretty recently, I think. I'm not sure how many decades ago it appeared there, but I don't think it was a super long time ago.
Great, thanks a lot, Dee.
Thanks.
Daniel Rudin, you raised your hand. Do you still have a question or a point?
Yeah, if nobody else does, I wanted to bring up something that Danny mentioned during the last teaching on social democracy, which was this point about political activity generating the opportunity for theoretical reflection. Like the Social Democratic Party provided a vehicle and a space for that theoretical reflection precisely because of the sustained and international political activity that it undertook. And so if you want to compare the New Left to the Second International, you could say, well, yeah, there's lots of activity, but that space for theoretical reflection doesn't seem to really exist in the same sense. So like if you take like an example like Gramsci, there are sort of two levels of political action, the war of position and the war of maneuver. And the war of position is setting up the second step, which is, I guess, the political activity or the war of maneuver. You're setting it up with propaganda or agitational work or what have you. And it seems like the New Left is sort of stuck at that stage because all of the activity is taking place in separate spheres or amongst separate cultural or ethnic groups. But there's never really an opportunity to bring it all together and subject it to theoretical objectification. And the political party and would be the space for that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Does that speak to some of the problems that we've been discussing?
Maybe. I mean, the reason, or I guess, the way that I kind of want to answer Audrey's question about like all this stuff never really reaching the level of politics is like, well, they don't have a political party, right? And I mean, maybe at the point where the New Left does try to start founding, or like the former New Left and the New Communist Movement starts to try founding political parties, it's already too late or something. Kind of hard to say, but my only point is to say that they actually do try to do this eventually, and it just doesn't work every single time, right? And I don't really have a good answer. I mean, I guess most of those 80s or 70s and 80s New Communist Movement parties I don't really see eye to eye on particularly, but I don't have a good answer for like why they weren't able to grow into something that was better than what they did, right?
Ask something on that, because I have been recently wondering, I've been thinking about, there is an impulse, Danny Jacobs has done a lot of this, and other older members of kind of going back and sort of filling out an area. And I have been thinking about going back to Spencer's interviews on the 1970s and the party building and kind of replumbing it. But I wondered how relevant it would be in the present. Like in some ways, if that poses a problem for people in the present, or if it really is so esoteric. But hearing you speak of it makes me wonder, the way that you said, well, maybe the 70s were too late. Like maybe the problem was that it wasn't so much the impulse, it was just too late, or it was just a bad, the way they went about doing it in the 70s was. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about that moment of the New Left, because the way you talk about it in the teaching is the Weather Underground, but the other impulse are all the party building, all the Marxist
All the Room
Leninists.
2 people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I meant to say in saying maybe it's too late is that maybe the problems that the New Left thought they were dealing with in sort of the 60s were already being dealt with by, in the run of ordinary capitalist politics by the time the 70s rolled around. So maybe that's true. I don't know. And as for the like maybe they just botched the execution in the 70s.
I just noticed that Danny Jacobs put in here that Cliff Slaughter, Hal Draper, and the Spartacists all thought that that period was the Iskra moment, that they saw themselves as like starting in the 70s. Does that like resonate to you, looking backwards and being somebody who's kind of come out of the millennial left, or does it kind of like seem ludicrous?
It seems a little ridiculous, and I guess I think I was talking about this with Audrey the other night. I recently had a chance to go listen to some people who had all industrialized in the 70s in the course of their involvement with various Maoist parties and the SWP. And they all said to a person, there are 4 of them, like, we thought that the revolution was about to happen. Like, this was the last step before things really started to pop off. And the remarkable thing is that the kind of purpose of this event was for them to kind of have the divide bridge between them and young DSA members who are going into unionized fields now. But the people now don't have any, like, they don't think that they're making the revolution or whatever. They just think that they're going to promote labor militancy. And these people from the 70s were all extremely happy about these young people doing this. They're like, it's great. You guys are doing exactly what we did. Even though in their own minds, the people who are involved, them in the 70s and these kids now, think that they're doing completely separate things. And I guess it's just, like, with that in mind, it brought up the question for me, if these people were in, like, was the thought that this period was revolutionary connected in a particularly strong way to the actual course of activity these people took? It seems hard to say, just from the perspective of the present. I guess requires more further research and funding.
No, it does. Yeah, no, it does make me think maybe there's something I should pursue there. But unless somebody wants to, I saw Danny Jacob coming in and off of mute. It's
always a good sign.
I guess. Well, I wanted to. I see that Kyle has the question, so we definitely should eventually get to Kyle's question. But I just wanted to bring up that I thought it was interesting, Conrad, when you brought up the timing of everything, because it is one of these things that you also said it's always an opportunity for a party. I agree, because so long as, we think this is not the end of history, then, hopefully the desire or necessity of revolution continues to sit in somebody's mind somewhere in that sense. But on the other hand of it, what you did bring up was that by the 70s, the discontents that the left had, I don't want to say gambled on, that they had kind of invested in, had been taken up by Richard Nixon, as Audrey mentions, right? And we do read The Black Particularity Reconsidered. I know you've read this essay a few times, where Adolph Reed does say, on the one hand is like the anti-war movement, and then the other side are the unions, right? This is the hard hat riots, but he says they're 2 sides of the same coin. So they are expressing the same discontent against the industrialization of society. They are bourgeois discontents with respect to the socialization of society, but they were politically led by the Nixon and then Reagan revolution. And so it should have been possible to found a party in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s and 2000s and 20s now, but the left continues to sort of actually lag the right. It continues to tail the right in terms of, I was just reading one of our panels on the Obama phenomena, and somebody on the panel was like, look, we need to hold on to the racialization of capitalism, like as an ideology. And Chris just kind of points out on the panel, like, no, you guys are like tailing the right in this sense. In other words, that had already been integrated into capitalist politics. So the reason I put all those people in the comment section is because it looks like they're going around in a hamster wheel, right? Like at the beginning of the 60s, they're like, we're in the Iskra moment. And then by the end of the 70s, they're like, we're in the Iskra moment.
I see.
Right? And that to me, and if you want a comparison, you can take Max Elbaum in the late 60s, who said he thought he was in a 1905 moment in his interview with Spencer. And that's also a historical distinction between a younger New Leftist and older New Leftists of what kind of moment it was.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you get into a situation where like you need to have some sort of political organization that spans across time periods and is capable of learning from experience. And yet your lack of ability to learn from experience or maintain a perspective that spans across time periods and take advantage of changing conditions renders you completely incapable of producing that party. But yeah, seems like a hard problem to get around.
Let's move.
Just on contemporary note, when it comes to the millennial left, I heard someone, a leader in DSA the other day, say that our task is to undo history. And when I heard that, I was like, this really is getting pretty conservative, isn't it?
Audrey, and then Kyle.
Yeah, well, undo history, that's explicitly what Joseph Goebbels said when the Nazis seized power. But
yeah, that's that specific quote was racing through my mind when I heard that.
Well, just the 1619 project as well. I mean, I guess I was going to say, on the one hand, like as Ogilvy says in the introduction to the New Left Reader, there's a kind of a waiting for Godot problem for the post-war sectarian Trotskyists. And then on the other hand, there's a too little too late problem with the neo-Narodniks of the early 70s. You know, like, did Godot appear and then we missed it, or what happened? Maybe the parallel between the early 70s and today is that, you know, both, I guess, sectarian sort of attempts to return to the party, or this sort of Iskra moment, this pre-revolutionary moment, that what's wrapped up in both is this misapprehension of being a pre-revolutionary moment when it's actually post-revolutionary, you know, when they both sort of lagged behind the revolution in capitalism. You know, the party's sort of over, party in the colloquial sense, but maybe in both senses. I just had a comment on that. I don't know if there's anything necessarily for you to add, but you know,
yeah, I was searching for the question in there.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think the conceptualization as being both too early and too late is probably a fair one. But often it just seems like being too late, because it's kind of hard to tell when you're too early for things.
And just to point out, like, I think the other way to look at it, because there was this question, I think, for some younger members about Iskra. This is the, you know, before there was a Russian Social Democratic Party, it started off, before the party, there was a kind of, you know, the newspaper. I mean, that's what it means, is in some ways, when all of these leftists said that, you know, we are circles, that's right. So before you know, there was a kind of preparatory period for the party, and all of the people that Danny quoted thought they were, you know, at the moment of forming a party, but they never do. But Kyle, we've left your question in abeyance for a while now. So Kyle, why don't you unmute your question, because it sounds like it has a little bit of setup, and so best you do it than I do.
Sure. I mean, it comes out of what we were talking about quite a while ago, but I was just kind of wondering, you know, just as a summary, to understand for myself, it seems, you know, like what was mentioned was that the New Left was responding to a genuine historical problem, but they failed in different kinds of ways. I was wondering, you know, was there anyone who was able to register the kind of genuine historical problem and how it diverged, or how the New Left diverged from a kind of actual engagement with that? And I was wondering, you know, like the relationship of someone like Adorno to the New Left? Is he just like a kind of merely an exterior figure to the New Left, or are there people within the New Left who were able to register this? So I'm just wondering, and what does the intellectual have to do with this, or what was that? What you mentioned, that strata of intellectuals?
So the strata of intellectuals that I was referring to really is, not particularly connected to like critical theory in any terribly direct way. I mean, most of the stuff, if you pick up the New Left Reader, read a few of these people who are like leaders in the SDS or leaders in the confusingly also named SDS in Germany, but different acronym. And you don't, I mean, they're well-read people and they can write pretty good prose, but you don't get the impression that they're really dealing with things at the same kind of register that someone like Adorno is. I think, and maybe other people can chime in on this, but I think Adorno, in retrospect, seems to be mostly registering a kind of missed opportunity for the New Left. I think I characterized it in the paper as like sort of a perspective of going through as opposed to going against things, where it does turn out that just like sort of going against things fits into the confines of capitalist politics pretty well, whereas going through is more of a long-term, complicated, and treacherous kind of project. One that is just like not taken up at all.
Thanks, Kyle. Does anybody, there's a little break here in the questions and the responses. Anybody relatively new to this material have any questions about it? Like there's been a lot of terms, Iskra and all of these things thrown around. Anything strike you or anything that you want to take up? It's a good chance for this. Okay, let's give this let's maybe wrap this up a little bit in the next 10 minutes or so people can get on their way. But any other points, any other things that Conrad brought up that you'd like to sort of explore a little bit more for anybody?
Yeah, you said something earlier about, if it's not automatically clear to us, sorry, my cat's right here. If it's not automatically clear to us, like who the historical subject is, then, we're in a lot of trouble. And I don't know, I kind of think that maybe that's part of the, problem, I guess, for this like approach to the revolutionary subject, the new revolutionary subject, which is that like the search for this new kind of source of consciousness is expected to be like historically given, like not built or developed, but just like there. And then you just have to like scoop it up tactically or organizationally and then like wield it as like a weapon or something. And I think that I don't know, I think that maybe that comes from this kind of just being buried beneath the rubble of Stalinism, just this complete naturalization of the reification of the working class, this kind of sociological view of the working class that maybe was carried on to these new sort of constituencies that ended up just helping the Democratic Party give it a makeover, which it has today. The makeup's starting to smudge today. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to kind of bring up that point. I mean, because otherwise, if we do just write off this period and these people as like not having the right thoughts, like not thinking about things properly or going about it, then we're not really grasping their historical moment and what they're actually up against.
Well, you know, the thing I think about is like there's a in the chat here. It might have been you, Audrey. Somebody pointing the path. Daniel Rudin, the path not taken. That there were attempts to sort of recognize in these different groups their potential, rather than their fully formed character. You know, and that is significant, the way in which some people sort of grasp that maybe there is a kind of process involved here, or the contradiction is expressed in sexuality, and that would, you know, there is something there to organize around, but it is taken up. The way that you described it is like the discontents are fully formed and need to be, you know, wielded tactically, is a different conception than Juliet Mitchell had.
It's different than Mitchell, but I don't know about Pistone, honestly. So, I mean, looking to, you know, the students, and then, I mean, obviously like Marcuse's letter to the New Left, not letter to the, it's, I think it's just called like for the New Left, maybe. You know, it's kind of like, I think his most explicit articulation of like his kind of support for this early version of Maoism that kind of took hold and that ended up forming the sort of, you know, I don't know, motivation for what's now considered like the McGovern coalition. Yeah, Mitchell's referring to Juliet Mitchell, yeah.
Well, you know, maybe
Well,
the
I
thing
managed
is
to
that the unsatisfying
more
part of
layers to
Postone is in some ways is like because he can't see the development of you know, it's only until the 60s that you have a post-proletarian kind of consciousness. So it has that fully formed character. It's only when it's fully formed is revolution possible, or something. I'm just thinking about the way that you put it, Audrey, which I found quite striking.
Yeah, I guess with Mitchell, actually, she is the essay that I posted in the chat box. She starts out looking for this kind of revolutionary subject. I think that's how she prefaces her essay, and then she kind of discovers orthodox Marxism along the way, or something. I guess with Postone, he's like, wait, you know, like there are these like capital reconstituting revolutions, and this sort of like he doesn't quite connect the dots back to Stalinism or something, and there are lots of missing pieces, but he's identifying that as a problem, that revolution can simply reconstitute capital. It seems to be an important discovery in certain respects. Maybe there's only so much you can do with it, but I guess they're each kind of locating something very important that other new leftists aren't, is the main point.
I mean, in the piece that we do read during the Neo Marxism week on the syllabus from Postone, he does sort of praise like Lukács over, you know, the sort of standpoint of the proletariat versus, you know, a sociological idea of the working class. And then he uses, you know, unfortunately, like Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky as like a sort of bogies of traditional Marxism. But then, you know, he ends up kind of pointing to this potential for students or people interested in ecology and, you know, the sexual revolution and that sort of thing. And maybe he was just a product of his moment where this sort of burgeoning Maoist imagination was just too powerful. I mean, this kind of like collapse of critique into just the entities that aren't yet fully integrated into society under the weight of this sort of like, you know, post-war homogenization of society. Maybe it did seem really plausible to them, but I don't know. I don't know if anyone else has. I'm kind of just rambling at this point.
I was just going to say something about, you know, like the obviousness of like, you know, the thing where if you're having trouble figuring out who the revolutionaries are, you're in trouble. I think less, you know, when I'm saying that, you know, the new left's definitely inheriting kind of the fetishization of the industrial working class. But I guess I'm thinking more back to the 19th century when there were a lot of revolutions that happened that were put on by all sorts of people in society, right? And it wasn't hard for Marx to look at the revolutions of 1848 and say, all these people are, behaving in revolutionary ways. I wonder what's up with that, right?
There was class struggle. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be different because that's not the case for them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sense in which I'm saying they're sort of in trouble.
That's where Adorno comes in, I guess, to get at what Kyle was bringing up earlier. Also, it's like, well, what do you make of Marxism as a kind of politics after the end of class struggle? After the end of politics, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay, we're coming to the end here, and I thank you so much, Conrad. That was an excellent teach-in, and lots of clapping coming in here. Nick wanted to know what movie is being played tomorrow, and it is going to be Reds with Warren Beatty. It's a really remarkable movie. If you haven't seen it before, it covers the early history of the socialist movement in the U.S. As an Oregonian, the first scenes are in Portland. So it's very good. But it also covers the beginning of the Communist Party in the United States and also the Russian Revolution. So I'm not sure we're going to cover it all in tomorrow's screening, but it's at 7 p.m. We might stop at the intermission and do the next week after that. But if you go to the Bay Area Facebook page, you can get it there, and maybe somebody could bring up the link and put it in the chat.
Are we gonna do it on Discord again? Is it Patrick, or is he gonna stream it on Discord?
I think that's right, because it didn't work that well on whatever he was using the last time.
Yeah, Discord worked pretty well. I mean,
it did. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, and there's a question about, oh yeah, that discussion. Somebody, so Michael wrote in and asked about this panel. Well, this panel, the radical interpretations of the present crisis, actually is on our website, and maybe if somebody can dig up the New York Goldner Harvey climatic audio, that would be great. And the last thing I just wanted to say is, in 2 weeks, we're going to have Carson Wright from the Corvallis chapter, another Oregon person, covering the Michael wrote the discussion. No, that discussion wasn't recorded, Michael. Apologies. But we will be doing the 1980s post-political left, and I know Carson has been thinking a lot about this, and Carson has also has done a lot of writing on sort of environmental politics, but also Adam Curtis. I think Adam Curtis is in the back of his mind. So join us.
Oh, interesting.
In 2 weeks for the post-political left, and then Huang is going to bring us home at the end, and Huang's on the call right now with the millennial left.
Can I ask, has anybody seen the new Adam Curtis thing all the way through? I watched the first episode. It was really good. They can't get out of my head.
Yeah, I've heard lots of people found it really compelling, and we've been thinking about Adam Curtis as like a person, an interlocutor. There's been some discussion on the list about.
That'd be really cool, in my opinion.
All right, well, we'll get cracking on it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and thank you so much, Conrad, for pulling together what is a daunting, subject.
Later, folks.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.